This is planet Zebes. Pretty crappy place, acid rain coming from the atmosphere, the violent wildlife, and it's home to a band of ruthless space pirates bent on using a dangerous alien species called the Metroids to take control of the galaxy. But little do they know, they're about to get their cheeks clapped by this legendary bounty hunter, Samus Aran. This isn't the first time she's taken them down on this very planet, but history repeats itself. And with the help from a baby Metroid, one she saved after wiping out its entire species, Samus gains the strength to take down the space pirate leader, Mother Brain. The fight is over, and the planet is reduced to space dust. This was the end of the 1994 hit Super Metroid, a perfect emotional and satisfying conclusion to Samus's story. At least that's what the director intended. Metroid fans would starve for years, aside from her appearances in Smash Bros., until the turn of the new millennium happened. Nintendo would make a special announcement at their big conference, Space World 2000. A Metroid game was lined up for their latest console, the Nintendo GameCube. After years of waiting, Samus would return in 3D glory. This time, players would immerse themselves in a first-person perspective, experiencing everything behind her visor. And not just that, Nintendo rewound the clock in the timeline, revealing more about Samus's adventures after her first mission on Zebes. But what no one knew at the time was the absolutely wild development story behind this game. I've covered a lot of dev stories on this channel, but this one definitely takes the cake. So let's dive into the Metroid Prime series and see how Nintendo fleshed out the series, Samus's character development, and while we're at it, we'll peel back the curtain on this dramatic development story. Welcome to Mentoktober. Metroid Prime opens with Samus tracking down the space pirate frigate Orpheon. The crew, already decimated, overrun by creatures they were experimenting on. So Samus lands on the frigate, and right from the start, the game introduces players to one of Metroid Prime's core features, scanning. Samus uses her scan visor to uncover lore, enemy weaknesses, and backstory logs as she's journeying through this ship. And this sets up a crucial aspect of the game. Information is power. You'll be scanning everything from enemies to environmental hazards, which builds the sense of exploration the series is known for. The game doesn't spoon feed it to you. You as a player will have to explore and figure things out yourself. As Samus navigates these chaotic halls, she encounters aggressive parasites, the result of failed biological experiments, as well as half-dead space pirates who are probably regretting their life choices. Oh, you bitch, you're still shooting at me? So Samus will go deeper into this frigate, and the gameplay gets you familiar with her initial loadout. You'll start with her iconic abilities like the charge beam, missiles, and the morph ball, but this time it's first person, teaching the player very quickly how to utilize these abilities. And as you're scanning throughout the ship, you'll uncover the pirates' grim secrets. They've been conducting biological experiments on dangerous creatures using a mutagen called Phazon. This toxic substance twists and corrupts life forms, making them even more dangerous and volatile. And one of these creatures, the Parasite Queen, awaits Samus at the ship's core, leaving her no choice but to take it down. After a fierce battle, Samus defeats the Parasite Queen, but its fall triggers a catastrophic system failure, putting the frigate on a path to destruction. In a race against time, Samus flees the ship, only to catch sight of a familiar enemy, Ridley. Now known as Meta Ridley, her old foe is revived with cybernetic enhancements after their scuffle on Zebes during the first Metroid game. But there's no time for fighting, he flees, so Samus can only follow his lead. But during her escape, her suit is damaged, giving us a reason to power up her suit all over again during the course of the game. Despite this setback, Samus manages to evacuate and the frigate goes boom. But Samus has her work cut out for her still. There are way too many questions that need answering here. So she hops into her ship and chases down Ridley, bringing her to the planet Talon 4. This planet will serve as the setting for the game. It's quiet, but kind of peaceful and beautiful. It's a very stark contrast to the harsh, eerie world of Zebes. This feels different, and I wouldn't be surprised if the developers had intentionally made it this way. But just like that, the game opens up for the player to explore. What makes Metroid Prime stand out is how much of the plot is revealed through scanning. Players can dig into both Chozo and space pirate logs to piece together what's been happening on this strange planet. But before we do that, I wanted to take a quick look at the manual. Dead art in the gaming world these days. But this is probably the biggest lore dump the series has received since the Nintendo Power comic for Super Metroid 8 years prior. It covers the major plot points from the series so far, like Samus being orphaned as a young girl after a space pirate raid, being taken in by the Chozo and being infused with their DNA, making her an unstoppable warrior, as well as a recap of her first attack on the planet Zebes where she takes down Ridley, Kraid, and Mother Brain. We already know from the Super Metroid manual that the Chozo are an ancient bird-like race that were extremely advanced and developed technological marvels, but this passage builds on the idea that they traveled through space, settling in various locations, and were very open to sharing knowledge freely with other cultures. But at one point, their technological advances peaked, and with Chozo culture being very rooted in prophecy, they foresaw the decline of their species and the rise of evil. The fear of the increase in evil and violence in the galaxy shifted their approach to things, and they started to become a more isolationist society while relying less on technology. And as Samus soon learned, some of the Chozo settled on Talon 4 and built a refuge with limited technology and temples built only from the natural materials from the planet. On the flip side, the manual also expands on the space pirates who have been terrorizing the galaxy, but it sheds some new light on their operations after Samus' Zero mission on Zebes. After being defeated, the space pirates split into two factions. One returned to Zebes to rebuild their base and revive Mother Brain, which would lead into the events of Super Metroid, while the other set out to find a new planet with energy resources they could exploit. This led them to Talon 4, where they discovered Phazon, and they began experimenting with it to create dangerous new weapons and enhance their soldiers. So as Samus explores Talon 4, we experience Prime's non-linear gameplay, where upgrades like the Morph Ball, missiles, and the Varia suit allow you to backtrack and access new areas. Much like previous titles in the series, every region feels distinct with its own ecosystem and environmental storytelling. The lava-filled Magmor caverns, for example, serve as a geothermal power source for the space pirates' research, while the Chozo ruins are filled with lore, detailing their struggle against the Phazon. The world itself tells the story just as much as the scan logs do. We discover that the Chozo are able to see premonitions, and it's clear that they're afraid of what the future holds. An incoming cataclysm and a destructive creature along with it. Lo and behold, this prophecy comes true, so while they're settled on Talon 4, a meteor impacted the planet. Turns out that this meteor is the source of the Phazon, that mutagen that begins to negatively affect all manners of life. But there's more to this prophecy. The coming of the worm. Hey, yo! Born from parasites, nurtured in a poisoned womb, the worm grows, devouring from within, until the world begins to rot. So the Chozo take it upon themselves to try and stop the Phazon, but can only contain the source at the impact site. At that point, all they could do was trust the prophecy. A woman in one of their suits would one day come to stop it. So using 12 Chozo artifacts, the Chozo managed to create a containment field, seal the meteor's energy at the impact site, and then scatter the artifacts across the planet. But still, their civilization succumbs to the Phazon 50 years before present day. Damn! Samus' journey brings her to the Phendrana Drifts, another Chozo ruin that's been repurposed into a space pirate research lab. And that's when this nightmare becomes real. Metroids were brought here, and not just that, they're being augmented by Phazon by the space pirates who hope to create dangerous biological weapons of war. There are even logs here where the space pirates discuss using their own young as experiments for the Phazon. Over and over, we see that their tests with Phazon give the subjects a boost in power, but still they all succumb to the same aggressive, uncontrollable nature. Seemingly, the space pirates hope to be able to control these experiments before everything went to shit. So now that we know Metroids are involved, the stakes of this little trip have been raised, and Samus travels to the planet repairing and upgrading her suit with the arsenal the Chozo have left behind. But her mission is becoming clearer. 1. Stop the space pirates and their experiments. 2. Find and take down Meta Ridley. And 3. Eliminate the source of the Phazon. So this is definitely a lot for one bounty hunter, so while she prepares herself, let's talk about how this game came to be. Because this one indeed turned the Metroid formula on its head, but the way that this development story goes, I'm surprised this game even exists in the first place.
The cold silence of space only punctuates the feeling of death that emanates from this virtually lifeless planet.
After the release of Super Metroid in 1994, the Metroid series was on hiatus. As I mentioned in my previous video, Super Metroid was intended to be the finale, so go ahead and check that one out if you haven't, by the way. Nintendo's next console was the Nintendo 64, and the plan was originally to develop a Metroid game for that console, with Mario and Zelda creator Shigeru Miyamoto planning to be the producer. Unfortunately, they struggled to come up with ideas for how this would work. Yoshio Sakamoto, the director for Super Metroid, tried his hand at coming up with a Metroid 64, but has said in the interview he couldn't imagine how the N64 controller could be used to control Samus. And I don't blame him, I still don't understand how we were okay with this controller. This led Nintendo to try their hand at outsourcing the development for a new Metroid title for their next console, the Nintendo GameCube. Enter Retro Studios, a game studio from America. Yes, established in 1998 in Austin, Texas, Retro Studios was founded by Jeff Spangenberg, an experienced programmer and producer at this point in time, and founder of Iguana Entertainment, a company responsible for hits like Turok Dinosaur Hunter and the console versions of NBA Jam. In 1995, Iguana was acquired by Acclaim, and 3 years later, they fired Jeff, which led to him responding with a lawsuit for breach of contract, to which they settled for an undisclosed amount. So at this stage, Jeff is a very wealthy man, and he goes on to establish Retro Studios in his own home. He'd run to Nintendo of America to secure a partnership and funding, and managed to secure that deal to create games for a more mature demographic to appeal to Western audiences once they launched the Nintendo GameCube. The studio grew rapidly, growing to have about 200 employees, fueled by Nintendo's generous investments. But despite this growth, the work environment has been documented as chaotic, and Nintendo started to become more attentive about what was going on behind closed doors. So now at this point, their executives had a large say in their work, unhappy with the early demos they had seen from Retro Studios. But at that time, Retro was working on 4 absolute bangers for the GameCube, like Metaforce, Car Combat, NFL Retro Football, and Raven Blade. I'm just kidding, these were all cancelled. Miyamoto and other members of Nintendo Japan visited Retro Studios to take a look at their work, and his response? Disappointed. So basically what happened on their first visit, it was a bloodbath. A Retro employee recalls, "They hated everything that we were doing. We weren't developing games in their philosophy. It was a huge cold splash of water in the face." But Miyamoto did like something, Metaforce, with him feeling impressed with the first-person shooter engine they'd developed for it. He wanted them to take on the next Metroid game using that system. So Miyamoto granted them the license to the Metroid franchise, and it was off to the races. But the development story doesn't end there, because this would be a rocky adventure for Retro Studios. Jeff Spangenberg has been reported to have arrived in the parking lot in his new Ferrari a few months after Nintendo Japan's visit, and he would lay off half his employees during the development of Metroid Prime, with the 4 other games they're originally developing all being cancelled. So the mood at the studio was tense, with some of the developers focused more on their resumes than the game itself. My guy Jeff here is an interesting character. His employees would say that they were lucky to see him once every year in the office, and he is reported to have some interesting extracurricular activities, like running a website called Sinful Summer that had pictures of the pool parties at his house, complete with strippers and scantily clad women. And get this, he was using Retro's servers to host this site. So believe it or not, Nintendo wasn't the biggest fan of Jeff either, and ended up buying his stake to become the majority shareholder, and quickly ousted him, replacing him with Steve Barcia, the vice president of development at that time. And this is how Retro Studios became a first-party Nintendo studio. So after all the chaos and destruction, all that was left was a really talented skeleton crew that put in insane amounts of work into Metroid Prime, taking 6 months to develop the very first level that Nintendo approved, and then they had less than a year to finish the game. Nintendo assisted in-house by creating the music and helping with overall design, communicating with Retro through emails and telephone conferences. They initially developed this title as a third-person shooter, but Miyamoto would suggest committing to first-person all the way through to make shooting more intuitive. The director of Metroid Prime, Mark Pacini, supported this decision, but unlike most first-person shooters at that time, he wanted to place heavy focus on exploration with this title, saving the challenging combat for boss encounters so the player could explore in peace. As for Samus herself, throughout the game the player can see glimpses of her reflection throughout the game, during larger explosions that would tease her new model. Originally, Cindy Crawford's face would be used as a reference before they refined it further, and at the end of the game, she's fully revealed. Though there's all these cool unused animations that were intended to be in this game which gave her much more personality, but these would end up being left out of the final product. So despite being a studio at the brink of death and put through the ringer several times over, Retro Studios completed Metroid Prime, and while fans were skeptical of the first-person perspective at first, it would become one of the best-selling games on the GameCube, and was met with critical acclaim, selling 2 million copies worldwide. As for our guy Jeff here, he would go on to create top-heavy studios and developed the Guy game, which seems much more up his alley, but the story doesn't even end there. The game would get slapped with a lawsuit because it featured an underage woman. Jeff was never seen in the industry again.
Only one thing is alive and well here.
Evil.
So Samus finds the Phazon mines where the space pirates have been salvaging Phazon for their experiments. The difficulty spike at this part is no joke, by the way. Within their research logs, we'll learn that they discovered the worm creature that the Chozo prophesized. It has the ability to stomach limitless amounts of Phazon without consequence. We'll find out later that this creature is the Metroid Prime, but more on that thing later. So with these capabilities, the space pirates have taken a huge interest in how to find it and control it. And then there's the boss of the stage, the Omega Pirate. Despite still being aggressive, these pirates are no longer themselves. So after an intense battle with the Omega Pirate, Samus is awarded the Phazon suit. And to finish this mission, she seeks out the Chozo artifacts hidden across the planet to confront the source of the Phazon directly. And with all 12 Chozo artifacts in her possession, she heads to the impact site to find Meta Ridley, just waiting here to ruin her day. But that's convenient for us because we needed to kill him anyway. With Meta Ridley defeated, Samus now has only one thing left to do: confront the ultimate horror lurking beneath the surface of Talon 4. Samus will enter the impact site to discover the Metroid Prime. It's time for the final scrap. Oh yeah, so while they go at it, there's this little elephant in the room.
What is that?
Is it actually a Metroid? Confusion around this topic originates when Retro Studios was writing this story back in 2000, based off of the loose lore that existed for Metroid at that time, which would leave them open to some inconsistencies. In the original North American release of this game, the creature arrived on Talon 4 within the meteor and was given the name Metroid Prime by the space pirates, who successfully managed to infiltrate this impact site and add weapons and other enhancements to the creature. So this version of events implies that the Chozo built this force field to contain both the impact site and this creature that was believed to have come from a different planet. But later on, Nintendo and Retro would say, hey, if Samus is going around collecting Chozo artifacts to get into the crater that was already infiltrated by space pirates, maybe that doesn't make too much sense. Yeah, and maybe it makes more sense that she's the only one who can enter the impact site because the Chozo set it up that way, knowing that she'd one day arrive to do so. Also, if the Metroids were created by the Chozo for a specific purpose on SR388, how the hell would a Metroid have gotten into this meteor and engorged itself on all this Phazon? So due to all of these questions, Nintendo and Retro Studios refined the lore later on, clarifying certain inconsistencies in later versions of the game. This would include many of the Chozo and space pirate logs that you read within the game. So the definitive running story right now is when the space pirates brought Metroids to Talon 4 for Phazon experimentation, some of them escaped containment and one found its way into the impact crater, feeding off of Phazon to become the Metroid Prime. This updated lore also clarifies that while interested in getting into that crater to take advantage of the Metroid Prime, the space pirates are unable to access it. So in the end, while Metroid Prime is now officially considered a Phazon mutated Metroid, some elements of its origin remain open to some interpretation. But give me your best theories on this. So Samus's fight with the Metroid Prime is long and challenging, with it taking on two forms, the exoskeleton form and what's known as the core form, but after enough blasting it finally goes down. But in its last moments, it manages to absorb Samus's Phazon suit, ripping it from her power suit before it explodes along with the crater itself as Samus flees to her ship. So as the game ends, we get a shot of her face for the first time in 3D. With her mission complete, she finally leaves Talon 4. But if you went out of your way to collect all the items, you find out that this saga is far from over. So after the Metroid Prime absorbs Samus's Phazon suit, we see an arm emerging from the impact crater with the last shot of a human eye. So as I mentioned before, Metroid Prime was pretty successful, while the team at Retro Studios were physically and mentally exhausted by the time launch came around. But hey, the game's selling well, so the higher-ups decided to implement a program for employees to collect royalties, with a group of managers and employees spending days determining who would get what and trying their best to be fair with how the royalties were distributed. Everyone was happy. But the new CEO, Steve Barcia, would just come in one day and change all the numbers, with 7 or 8 people making the most and the others getting total shit compensation. According to the employees at Retro, they told Polygon that an accountant leaked the whole royalties spreadsheet to the entire company, and everyone found out who was making what. In response, all employees were sent home early that day, and the information was scrubbed from their computers, all while gamers were enjoying every last bit of their hard work. So after all this, morale was pretty terrible and many employees threatened to leave. So Nintendo, after hearing this news, had to step in and replace Barcia with a new CEO, Michael Kelbaugh, who runs the company to this day. And you'll be happy to know it's a much healthier work environment and would become one of Nintendo's most trusted studios. But back in that time, with all that squared away, it was time for Retro Studios to prove themselves with a direct sequel to their hit title, and that's when we got Metroid Prime 2 Echoes.
Two separate worlds. One shadow, one light.
Some time passes after the events of Metroid Prime, and the game opens with a haunting mission briefing. Contact with a Federation trooper squad was lost, with their last transmission coming from a rogue planet known as Ether. I wonder if the Federation police or army has done anything right. I guess I'll find out eventually. Anyway, Samus is contracted to investigate, and this planet is also a shithole, with Samus's ship taking some damage on the way into the atmosphere. But she's back, and she's ready to kick some ass. Hell yeah. The opening area is desolate, with remnants of battles scattered across the terrain, wreckage from the Galactic Federation's fleet strewn about, and dead soldiers lying cold and lifeless. The once thriving planet of Ether now feels like a graveyard. But there's no time to mourn, as those soldiers don't stay dead for long. Something dark stirs in their corpses, and suddenly, without warning, the fallen Marines rise, possessed by an otherworldly force, with this moment being a chilling reminder that on Ether, nothing is as it seems. After fending off the undead Marines, Samus stumbles upon a temple-like structure that holds some of the answers she's searching for, until she finally encounters something truly terrifying. Her doppelganger, Dark Samus. This is what spawned after the defeat of Metroid Prime. So Samus goes after Dark Samus in the portal and is thrust into this alternate dimension known as Dark Ether. The planet of Ether is revealed to be split into two different dimensions, and switching between the two will be the setting for the player in Metroid Prime 2. And some creatures called Ing pull up and strip her of all her power-ups and throw her ass back through the portal. It's not a Metroid game unless we have an excuse to have Samus start with nothing. So the stage is set. Samus must go on another journey to recover her power, face off with the Ing and Dark Samus, and uncover the mysteries of Ether. And sure, they could have just gone back and repurposed everything from the first game, but they decided, nah, we're gonna make a fresh one. With Retro wanting to move away from the usual plot of the space pirates and Metroids, and use the theme of the conflict between good and evil instead, hence all the parallels found within the game. So to take it a step further, they would consult with the producers of The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, known for having two versions of Hyrule. Returning to compose the soundtrack was Kenji Yamamoto, who I've failed to mention after all this time, but just know he was the one responsible for the bangers heard throughout Super Metroid and Metroid Prime, and has been the prime supervisor for sound in many of Metroid titles up to this day, except Other M, but we'll get to that one next video. But Yamamoto would use the light and dark theme to create variations of each track to represent both versions of each realm. Dark Samus would be chosen as the game's main antagonist, a character that was on equal footing as Samus in size compared to all the other massive monsters and space pirates she normally took on. And in a sense, that choice made Dark Samus even more unnerving. They would draw inspiration from the end section of Metroid Zero Mission, the remake to the original Metroid game released on the Game Boy Advance in 2004. In one of the final sections, Samus must travel to a Chozo ruin on Zebes and looks into a mirror before being given a trial that unlocks a brand new power suit. Retro Studios would take this interaction a step further and introduce Dark Samus after thinking fighting herself was cool. This sequel was an ambitious one, with the new Retro president saying that he and the team wanted to expand it as much as they could instead of just slamming out a sequel. But the deadline was tight, set for a 2004 holiday release. As a result, Echoes would only be around 30% complete 3 months before that deadline, just to put the crunch in perspective here. So many features had to get the cut, including a potentially unlockable extra of a playable Super Metroid. But once again, Retro Studios beat the odds and got out a completed game in November 2004. So let's get back to Samus, stripped of her power and humbled by the Ing. But as she explores Ether, she meets Umos. Or is it Umos? Umas? The last sentinel of the Luminoth, the race that call Ether their home. They've been at war with the Ing for decades, and these dark creatures spawned after a meteor struck Ether 50 years ago, creating this dark alternate realm along with it. If this sounds familiar, we'll find out that this was another Phazon meteor. So Umos tasked Samus with finding all the light of ether the Ing have taken from the planet, or else they're fucked. There are 3 pieces of the light of ether Samus will have to retrieve from each region on the planet: Aegon Wastes, Torvus Bog, and Sanctuary Fortress. The gameplay takes full advantage of the contrast between these 2 worlds, requiring Samus to gather upgrades and navigate the labyrinth structure of each temple while dealing with the constant threat of the Ing. Despite the focus less on the space pirates this time around, they're also present on planet Ether, still trying to move forward with their Phazon-related project. As Samus retrieves each piece of the light of ether, the stakes continue to rise. She'll occasionally encounter Dark Samus, who grows more powerful with each clash, becoming an ever-present threat in her mission to save Ether. And Dark Ether is pretty hostile in itself, with this caustic atmosphere continuously draining Samus's energy, forcing her to navigate the world using what's called safe zones, which really puts more pressure on the player and tests their endurance. It's a pretty stark contrast to the more atmospheric exploration of the first Metroid Prime, adding more tension and difficulty at every turn. And the deeper Samus dives into the conflict, the more intense her battles will become. She faces formidable bosses, and the Ing prove to be a much more intelligent and organized enemy than we originally believed. But Samus, with each upgrade in every fight, becomes more equipped to deal with the threats. So as the game culminates in a final showdown with the Emperor Ing, the true leader of Dark Ether, Samus was finally retrieved the last of the lights of ether, causing the collapse of Dark Ether itself. But just as the planet crumbles around her, Dark Samus reappears for one last scrap. Hell yeah. After an intense final confrontation, Samus narrowly escapes back to Ether, leaving Dark Samus and the Ing to be consumed by the collapsing dimension. And I think this last little cutscene with the Ing tried to make you feel somewhat bad for them. But with the light of ether restored and the Luminoth awakened from their long hibernation, Samus has once again saved the day. There's a short moment of celebration, the Luminoth thanks Samus, and she departs the planet in her repaired ship.
Chicks are crazy for a certain burly wool, a real sharp curly wool.
But if you manage to complete the game with all the items, there's another post-credit scene hinting that Dark Samus isn't quite done yet. Wait, and there's multiplayer? Oh yeah, for the first time in this series, players can take each other on in a deathmatch, complete with 6 arenas, building off that Halo hype at the time, no doubt. But still, this was a big move for the series, and I'm honestly trying to get a group together to somehow play this with me in 2024. Nope. I'll let you know how that goes. But Metroid Prime 2 would once again receive critical acclaim, with its challenging gameplay and focus on the light-dark elements making it stand apart from its predecessor. Retro Studios once again proved they could deliver a high-quality Metroid experience, cementing the Prime series as a critical part of the Metroid franchise. So of course, a third game was a no-brainer for Retro, but this time they would take it to Nintendo's next console, the Nintendo Wii.
We would like to play.
Okay, so despite that suspenseful lead up to Prime 3, there were spin-offs to Metroid Prime that I can't ignore. Like Metroid Prime Pinball for the Nintendo DS, released in October 2005. This is exactly what you would expect. Samus in a morph ball form pinballing her way through the plot of Metroid Prime. While Retro Studios wasn't responsible for this one, Kensuke Tanabe, producer of the Prime series, felt turning Samus's morph ball into a pinball was a no-brainer, and several Nintendo franchises already had a pinball game like Pokemon, Mario, and Kirby. So why not Metroid? The game takes the pinball mechanics we all know, flippers, bumpers, and ramps, and adds in Metroid elements like enemies roaming the table, wall jumping, and even the ability to fire weapons. As you progress through 6 tables inspired by areas from Metroid Prime, you'll fight bosses, gather artifacts, and eventually face Meta Ridley and Metroid Prime itself. What's notable is that it was packaged with the Rumble Pack, marking the first time that accessory was available for the DS, adding a tactile element to the experience. This was definitely a different time for Nintendo though, when we saw more experimental spin-offs from their major franchises. Speaking of spin-offs, Metroid Prime would get a spin-off more faithful to its gameplay style. Metroid Prime Hunters for the Nintendo DS, released in 2006. This was developed in-house by one of Nintendo's smaller teams, with Kensuke Tanabe returning as producer. The story takes place after the events of Metroid Prime, as Samus is pulled into another mission, this time in the Elimbic Cluster found in the Tetra Galaxy. She's sent in to investigate a strange message received by the Galactic Federation from the Olympic Cluster that was telepathically broadcast to several space hunters. The message? The secret to ultimate power resides in the Olympic Cluster. So these hunters go to find this power, and the Galactic Federation sends Samus to uncover the secret behind this power and stop it from falling in the wrong hands. Metroid Prime hunters expanded the universe with the introduction of several new bounty hunters, each with their own distinct abilities and personalities. And these characters like Sylux, Trace, Weevil, and Noxus not only gave players a more competitive multiplayer experience in this game, but also hinted at larger, unexplored corners of the Metroid universe. Sylux in particular would become a fan favorite and is believed to have a personal vendetta against Samus, leaving the door open for future confrontations. Though the story of Hunters mostly stands alone, we'll see Sylux's role take on more significance. Regardless, it's pretty cool just to see other Hunters aside from Samus. They're kinda hinted at in the manual for the very first game that there's other Hunters and Bounty Hunters out there, so props to them for at least trying to flesh out a few of them. I remember they pushed this game hard as an early title for the DS back in the day, and rightfully so. It looks pretty spectacular for a portable game at that time. But my feelings aside, this game did some pretty new things, most notably its online multiplayer, which allowed players to battle using a variety of new bounty hunters. This was a big deal at the time, especially since it was one of the early DS titles to take advantage of online play. I remember I still couldn't believe I could battle my friends over Wi-Fi when Pokemon Diamond and Pearl came out, and there was voice chat?
Yes, sir.
Good times. But with Hunters, Nintendo continued experimenting with the Metroid Prime formula, and this would pave the way for the highly anticipated third game in the series, Metroid Prime 3: Corruption. It's 2007, the Nintendo Wii has hit the market and it's selling like hotcakes, with strong launch titles like The Legend of Zelda, The Twilight Princess, and Wii Sports. But let's be real, everybody wanted it for Wii Sports. This was definitely a time, because motion controls had to be added to every game on this console. I'm exaggerating a bit, but it's kinda true. You had to swing your sword, shake the controller to make Mario twist, and for Metroid games, you were using this Wii remote and nunchuck to point at enemies and blast them. But as for Metroid Prime 3, this felt like the closer for a trilogy. This plot that they were building around the Phazon. The game cover shows that Dark Samus is back, and the commercials showed people who would never play Metroid Prime playing Metroid Prime. Still, the gameplay built on groundwork retro laid in previous games, so their major priorities for this one was to make a much larger open world with several new planets and properly integrating the Wii's controls. The project was once again pretty ambitious, with the team having to dial back a few features because of the lack of technical power within the Wii itself. Despite a small delay, Metroid Prime 3 Corruption would hit the market on August 27, 2007, during what Nintendo would dub the month of Metroid, which marked the 21-year anniversary of the Metroid series. So Metroid Prime 3 Corruption is set 6 months after the events of the previous game. The Space Pirates operation is in a shambles, and the Galactic Federation started confiscating their Phazon weaponry to repurpose for themselves.
You what?
The Chozo are rolling in their graves right now. The game opens with Fleet Admiral Castor Dane of the Galactic Federation fleet requesting a meeting with Samus and a few other bounty hunters named Rundus, Gore, and Gandrada. Don't get too comfortable with these people. So they're given this mission to clear virus from Aurora units, these organic supercomputers, which already sounds gross. Imagine this thing working in your home. But is clearly a slight reference to Mother Brain, who is also an organic AI thing. It's still gross. Anyway, before these bounty hunters go out on their mission, the fleet's attacked by space pirates, and so our hunters are quickly deployed to the planet Norion, where the main front of the attack is happening on the Federation base there. While fending off the assault, Samus runs into Meta Ridley again. No surprise that he survived, but this time he seems pretty pissed. They have this epic fight while endlessly plummeting down this shaft. It's awesome. Rundus saves Samus during her fall with his cool ice powers as Meta Ridley continues to careen down this endless pit, so I'm sure he's dead now. Samus learns some distressing but familiar news. A meteor will soon impact Norion, but not just any meteor, a Phazon meteor that's now referred to as Leviathan seeds. And this doesn't seem like a coincidence anymore, it seems almost intentional. Because of this, their priorities shift, so Samus and the other hunters must race to get the base's defense systems up to prepare for impact. But in the scramble to stop it, Dark Samus returns, blasting everyone with a Phazon beam and leaving Samus in a month-long coma. But in her last conscious moment, she saves the day by activating the defense system, destroying the meteor. Clutch. 1 month later, Samus wakes up to some grim news. She's been corrupted by Phazon, which her body is now producing internally. And to add insult to injury, the other bounty hunters have gone missing, also corrupted by Phazon. So her new mission? Find them. And the Leviathan seeds that they were tracking across multiple planets need to be destroyed. And this isn't just cleanup duty. Dark Samus is behind this, with each Leviathan seed being a living organism, designed to corrupt entire planets with Phazon to bring them under its control, making this a very dangerous threat to the galaxy. Though there's a small silver lining here, the Federation gears Samus up with the Phazon enhancement device on her suit. She can now use that Phazon energy to her benefit. This time around, there's multiple planets to explore, the first being Brio. Like Talon 4 and Aether, these planets are being corrupted by the Leviathan seeds, destined to die by the hands of the Phazon. Deep within Brio, Samus finds Rundus, his mind fully overtaken by Phazon and Dark Samus. In a tragic twist, she has no choice but to put him down. And after an intense battle, he meets his end, impaled by his own ice. Can I just say, game after game, I adore how no-nonsense Samus is. Despite the visor covering her face, the game still conveys her quiet strength and resolve through this body language. That subtlety is something the series has nailed from the very beginning, and they keep getting it right. With Rundus out of the way, Samus enters the Leviathan seed on Brio to face its corrupted guardian, Moganar. It seems that the will of the Phazon ensures that it has ruthless creatures in place to protect it from being destroyed. And even though Samus is victorious, her corruption starts to worsen. But still, there's a job to do, and she annihilates the seed's core. On to the next one. Her next stop is Elysia, where Gore has gone missing. And seeing what went down on Brio, it's pretty clear what awaits Samus here. And Elysia itself is fascinating. A violent gas planet with a city called Skytown, built 1500 years ago by the Chozo as a deep space research facility. I'll note that this is one of the great things about the Metroid Prime series. We see various planets that exist in the Metroid universe, and through exploration, we learn about their civilization and extinct ones too. These games carry the same sense of isolation while making these planets feel alive or previously lived on, and ruins, temples, and lore to give background on what life is like on these planets. It's not a requirement to read up on this stuff, but it still gives this amazing world building that leaves you wanting more. But Elysia is a mess though, thanks to the Leviathan seed and a space pirate attack that corrupted both the Elysians and their Aurora unit. So when Samus arrives, everyone is too far gone. But she manages to cure the Aurora unit of its corruption, but Gore, now controlled by the Phazon, confronts her. Samus must once again put an end to another one of her bounty hunter comrades. And after another heartbreaking battle, Samus defeats Gore. And as usual, Dark Samus shows up to collect. But the show must go on, so she heads into the Leviathan seed to destroy its guardian, Helios, before wiping out the seed itself. The final Leviathan seed impacted the space pirate homeworld, which I'm sure Samus thought about leaving as is, but the Phazon can't be left unchecked. So she heads there to track down Gandreda, and it's a shit show. The planet is on the brink of fully succumbing to the Phazon, and the conditions there are rough, with acid rain halting Samus's progress. Having to partner with a Federation Marine, Samus seeks out the Hazard Shield before getting ambushed by the trooper, who turns out to be a corrupted Gandreda in disguise. Okay, before she gets got, I want to point out how I always found her calling Samus Sammy being kind of cute.
You should never trust strangers, Sammy.
Anyway, she's dead now. Dark Samus returns to do its thing. But there's still more to be done on the space pirate homeworld. Samus disables their planetary shield so the Federation can launch a large-scale assault, and they end up covering her as she pushes her way into the Leviathan seed. Did the Federation do something useful for the first time in this series?
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
So she gets into the core, and it's probably no surprise who the seed chose as its guardian. Meta Ridley. Corrupted and upgraded, he is now Omega Ridley. We've come such a long way here. The battle is intense, but Samus pulls out the win, and I don't know, he looks pretty dead to me this time. With Ridley defeated and the last seed destroyed, Samus's Phazon corruption reaches its peak, glowing across her suit. But the mission isn't over. She has to press on.
Aurora Unit 217 reports that it has discovered the origin of the Leviathan attacks.
It appears that this is where Dark Samus and her main pirate force are stationed.
It's time to go blow up a planet. The home of the Phazon and the Leviathan seeds is called Phase, way off in distant space. Samus hijacks a Leviathan battleship the space pirates are constructing to open a wormhole to get there, and all that's left is to end this once and for all. Samus dives deep into Phase's core, her corruption nearly consuming her, and here she faces Dark Samus one last time. After a brief skirmish, Dark Samus merges with Phase's core guardian, Aurora Unit 313, a Federation Aurora unit that Dark Samus and the space pirates had stolen. So in this final intense battle, Samus defeats both the Aurora unit and Dark Samus, freeing herself from the Phazon's grip. The Federation ships open another wormhole and escape, and the galaxy is finally free from the Phazon threat. But wait, no sign of Samus.
Negative, sir. No contact.
Hell yeah. And in a rare moment of quiet, Samus takes a second to mourn her fallen bounty hunter comrades. You've earned that break, Samus. The war is over. But just as the credits roll, we get one last tease. As Samus departs, her ship is being followed by a mysterious ship. It turns out this is Sylux's ship for Metroid Prime hunters, but fans would be left hanging by this plot thread for, let me check, 17 years now? After this, Retro Studios took a well-earned break from Metroid, shifting their focus to revive another high-profile Nintendo series, Donkey Kong Country, in 2010. Meanwhile, Nintendo partnered with Team Ninja to develop a more traditional Metroid game, Metroid Other M, that same year. With Retro Studios busy on Donkey Kong Country Returns and Tropical Freeze, a true sequel to Metroid Prime 3 remained in limbo. But I can't say Prime fans were totally left high and dry, because 9 years later, they'd received their highly anticipated follow-up to Metroid Prime 3. Metroid Federation Force for the 3DS. This wasn't it. At E3 2015, fans were rightfully upset. It'd been 8 years since the last Metroid Prime game, and 5 years since the last Metroid title overall. This wasn't filling that void, and as you can see throughout these videos, the Federation Marines aren't exactly the most exciting group to play as. But we can't wrap up this video without talking about this game. Next Level Games, known for the Super Mario Strikers series, was tasked with developing this title, with Retro Studios only involved for design consultation while Kensuke Tanabe returned as producer. His concept was to expand the Metroid universe by shifting perspectives, which I think was fine, it just dropped at the worst possible time. You could compare its gameplay to Metroid Prime Hunters, but with more focus on cooperative multiplayer. The Federation Force is a squad of up to 4 customizable Marines, each with their own weapons and specialty to fight space pirate scum. And honestly, the idea doesn't seem terrible. I think for this title, it's very easy to throw around baseless shade. This is probably the only Metroid game I haven't played, so I'm not going to go that route. But I think its failure boils down to Nintendo just completely misreading the room. Fans were begging for Metroid Prime 4 or anything Metroid really, and this was a big announcement for the 30th anniversary of the series. So there's no surprise that it was met with disappointment. Nintendo was clearly embarrassed by the response too, as this game didn't show up at E3 the following year, and its sales were abysmal. Thankfully, Samus returned in 2017 with the 3DS remake of Metroid 2, Metroid Samus Returns. I mean, look at the subtitle, they knew. Sure, it's a reference to the original Metroid 2 Return of Samus title, but this time, the meaning was twofold. And honestly, I believe if these two games were announced together, the reaction for Federation Force probably would have been completely different. Federation Force is set after Metroid Prime 3, focusing on the Galactic Federation trying to finish off the space pirate threat. You play as this elite unit known as the Federation Force that's utilizing these cutting-edge mechs, traveling to the Bermuda system to investigate pirate activity. But to add salt to the wound, Samus is actually in this game, out there in the background running her own mission to gather intel on a space pirate superweapon called the Doomseye. But suddenly they lose contact with her, so the Federation Force has to infiltrate the Doomseye, where they find out that Samus was captured, brainwashed, and gigantified. Yeah, this plot's a little wild. So their mission is to fight Samus, defeat her, and then destroy the Doomseye. And remember that cliffhanger about Sylux at the end of Prime 3? Still unresolved. In the post-credits scene of this game, it's revealed that the Federation Force took a Metroid egg from the space pirates. Naturally, that egg gets stolen again, this time by Sylux, who forces the egg to hatch. This moment is where the Prime series leaves off, but Metroid fans are resilient. After the Federation Force controversy in 2016, Nintendo almost seemed to apologize with the 2017 release of Metroid Samus Returns. But during this special Nintendo Direct that same year, cheers were heard around the world. After all of that, Metroid Prime 4 still isn't out at the time of this video. It's a little unclear why development's taken this long, but we know Retro Studios wasn't involved at first. There are rumors floating around that Nintendo was working with Bandai Namco to make the game at first, but whatever was being made, Nintendo wasn't happy with it. And in 2019, they took the project back to Retro Studios and started from scratch. Regardless, I'm hoping we get the full development story on this game after it's finally released, and I'll be here to follow up and report it for you. Luckily, last summer, we finally saw some gameplay and the subtitle was given: Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, with Retro Studios finally making their return as developers. In this trailer, it's clear Sylux will be involved, most likely as a primary antagonist, but many questions remain. How will that baby Metroid come into play? Is this truly the last we'll see of Dark Samus? And assuming this is set after Metroid Prime 3, how will Ridley revive from corrupted space pirate guts to account for his appearance in Metroid Samus Returns further down the timeline? And finally, what the hell is Sylux after? I guess we'll find out next Mentoktober. But next up on the Metroid Marathon, we'll dive into the games that challenge a more seasoned Samus, where the threats become more personal and the stakes higher than ever.